calling the meeting to order. 1.02, our approval of the July 26th policy committee meeting.
Since it was just me and you, I'll move that we approve the meeting minutes.
And I will second. And all those in favor,
I'll abstain.
so 2, 4, and 1 abstention. Do we have any public comment this morning? Nobody. And does not.
Dr. Sergo is interested in anything?
No, I'm not commenting.
No?
You're talk about the AAP.
We didn't have any written
I
public
can be
comments.
here.
Okay.
So we will move right on to 1.04, policy 319, the administrative management technical AMT group.
Good morning, everyone. So the AMT group policy was previously approved back in March, I think. It is back again, largely to reformat it to fit the new template. There are some minor tweaks that I believe were made as part of that process, and I think Dr. Sarah Sergo, who is here up at the table with me, can speak to that.
We hope so, right?
Yes.
I'm not sure. No, it doesn't.
No,
Okay.
I don't think it's so.
So as you know, the AMT group is the administrative management team. It primarily refers to individuals who are at central office who typically come out of one of our bargaining units, but because they serve across our bargaining units, because they often serve as members of your board's negotiating team, they have to sort of absolve themselves of that affiliation. But we do then extend them some of those same benefits as we would for all employees around compensation, leave, all of those things. So this policy sort of stipulates that because they don't have a negotiated agreement, right? But they cover all different aspects. They're not just the most senior staff, or they are our secretarial staff. They are all individuals who are sort of serving in a central or system-wide capacity. So the edits that you have, I think you have both versions, the clean and the red line, just sort of reflect what those commitments are. So as our FCASA agreements change, we tend to sort of piggyback, historically, AMT piggybacks on that language to ensure that we aren't excluding any of our employees from those things that you negotiate for others. And so you'll see some of those changes reflect and refer to as agreed in the FCASA agreement. It sort of piggybacks on that and is reflected here. So we've just made edits to make that alignment clear.
And I think additionally there was some regulatory language regarding complaints that has been pulled out that will make its way into a regulation to make it so it's appropriately placed.
Last time we reviewed this, I feel like we spent the bulk of our discussion talking about the tuition reimbursement process and the obligations. We spent a lot of time on that. That's all been redlined, but I assume it's because ultimately what we went with was a match to what our agreement says. So
Correct. And we see people move in and out of the units, right? So, if you're maybe you were an AMT and you were a teacher specialist, or not teacher, that would not be good if you left out of AMT. If you were in the curriculum office and you decide to go back and be a school principal, or maybe you become an administrator. So we want to allow that continuity. Sometimes people come and serve in central office for a few years, and then they go back. Katie Buckley, who is our new director of special ed, is a great example of that. She was in one office, she went and served as principal. She's now back, and so we want to make sure we have that consistency of the benefits that we're offering, and also to encourage people to continue their education.
I'm in support of the changes.
Me too.
Any other questions?
Mark, this is ready to move forward to the board.
Thank you.
You're welcome to stick around.
I'll sit right here. Okay, policy 114, back again.
So policy 114 is back after having been before the board for its first reading on August 8th. At the board meeting, there seemed to be general support for the changes, but there were some edits that were asked for. And the revised policy as presented here should reflect those edits including in section D3A under the makeup of the policy committee, the annual designation of a member of the Citizens Advisory Council to participate in an advisory non-voting capacity, incorporation under the policy committee meeting section, the opportunity for submission of written comments to match the written comment language that is in policy 102. And I think that's it for the changes that were called for from the board. So that is here for your consideration, and then we can bring it back to the board for second reading on September 13th if it is approved.
I have a few questions. Bottom of page 2, when we're saying the agenda of the policy committee shall be posted to board docs at least 1 week prior to the policy committee meeting, I feel like that's a slightly stricter standard than we have for the rest of the board agenda, which generally we're publishing on Thursday for a Wednesday meeting. And yeah, I just want to be accurate about this on whether we're truly going to meet that 7-day standard, or if we want to, I don't know, say 5 or 6 days, or to make sure it's accurate.
So, I mean, I think we have been meeting that standard of getting it posted the Wednesday before. So it has been a week, but I certainly don't disagree with what you're suggesting, that we should match the practice that we have with respect to the full board meetings. What I can do is go back to policy 102, see what the language is with respect to it, and then just mirror it. And if it's the same, then, if it is as it is now, then I'll leave it. If it's not, I will redline it and highlight that when I bring it forward for second reading.
I think that it's typically posted the same day that our full
I think
board.
that
because
was our-
we're
just
meeting
at the
on
same
Mondays.
time,
But then that would be the Thursday. I
Correct,
think.
Yeah,
So,
it is.
yeah.
It's Thursday afternoon.
Yeah, so, yeah, we'll just want to make sure that's accurate. Potentially a larger question is top of page 3 on the factors to develop policy. Right now, it's in alphabetical order, so that's one way to do it. But because it's in alphabetical order, the very first thing listed there is cost implications, and that doesn't feel great to me that that's the first one listed. I mean, I guess our answer can be, well, we're listing these in alphabetical order, but yeah, would another option be thinking about level of importance that we are putting on these different factors? Should we list impact on those affected by the policy or federal, state, and local law and regulations ahead, since generally I think those would be ahead of cost implications in creating policy.
I mean, I don't think there was any intention in the order in which these are listed. I actually think this is existing language. I don't think this has changed.
Right.
So, I mean, that doesn't mean we can't change it if we want to. I don't know that there was any, intention in any way of prioritizing one over the other. And I think that it is a non-exhaustive list of factors, suggests that anything could be the priority. And in fact, we don't even have to necessarily be looking at cost implications if there are none. So, I mean, it's up to what this panel wants to do. If you want me to sit down and try and prioritize these in some other way, I can try and make that effort, or we can sit here now and work through them and order them in whatever order you'd like.
What do you guys think?
To me, I don't know that the order matters. I mean, some of them, the factors might weigh heavier depending on the policy that we're considering as well. And so maybe a neutral, like alphabetical order stance might just be more neutral, because there might be a heavier emphasis on one of these depending on the policy. But one of the factors, that you pointed this out, is that is not on here is the equity lens that we've really been trying to apply to all of our work within the system. And so I'm wondering if we should work that language into this section as well, for that emphasis on equity, which could go along with the impact on those affected by the policy, but because of our board's emphasis, and I think the system's emphasis on equity, I would like to see it. considered.
Well, I personally, I would have a hard time ordering them in a certain, prioritizing them. I'm sure all three of us could probably come up with a different order. Might we mention that it's a non-existent list of factors in no particular, in no particular order of importance? I mean, but I would have a hard time determining importance.
Based on the feedback from you guys, I guess two things I'd love to suggest would be, we could say non-exhaustive list of factors listed here alphabetically. It reads just, it's hard when truly reading through this for the first thing to be cost implications. It feels like that is the priority. So potentially, noting that this is alphabetical, but perhaps more important, I would support adding equity as one of the factors we're considering.
Yeah, I could certainly add equity as a factor 9 and slot it alphabetically where it belongs, or I can slot it at the top. I suspect, Mr. Rose, that if we've got about 10 people in the room, if we asked all 10 of us to prioritize this, we'd probably have 10 different lists.
Yeah, so I would rather, if we were going to do that, I'd rather us list either that it's listed intentionally in alphabetical order or it's in no particular order of importance. Whatever language you see is appropriate.
Okay.
For the equity clause, I'm just trying to think, should it just say as an equity, or I don't know, do we need to be more specific around equity toward those affected?
I'll consult with Dr. Harris on what the language should be for the insertion there. He's leading that charge.
Something out of the mission.
Yeah.
Or the equity
Statement or-
policy that we.
Yeah.
updated, maybe
Yeah.
a piece of that we can forward here.
I did have one more question here. Should we specify how long the board should expect regulations to come out after a policy is passed?
I can't speak to whether we should or should not. That's a decision that you all as the board need to make. All I can speak to is the complexity and challenges that come along with coordinating that. We are doing our very best to do that. We've increased the number of times the regulation review committee meets so we can get more policies or more regulations updated and reviewed. We're looking at ways that we can improve the efficiency within my office and actually processing them to get them posted. It is a challenge, and our goal is to get them contemporaneous so there's little gap, but I can't speak to whether we should or should not. Dr. Sergo has rejoined me. So
Yeah, so it's a great question. I think it depends on whether you're talking about generating a brand new policy, a brand new regulation, or revising something that exists. I think in my review of our regulations, and regulations more than policies, we have some gaps. So there's a lot of new regulations that we probably need to develop. So we have policies that don't have associated regs. That's an area of need. Then we have regs that haven't been looked at in as long as policies. So we have to pair that. And then you have sort of this body of work that, and I'll use the policy 117 as a great example, where it's not one reg. We actually had to look at 17. And so I think the circumstance depends. So looking at basically for policy 117, Dr. Harris led the team to go through everything we had and figure out which of the existing regs needed that language added. That took many, many months because each reg was owned by a different office. You had to get a different group of people together. And so that was a very substantial lift that I think it's taken the better part of 6 months. I think that's the exception because that one was so significant. So I would say on average, I wouldn't want to put language in a policy, but I would say, I think within 2 months, within 8 weeks, would be reasonable. I think that would sort of be our internal sort of compass for trying to be timely is, okay, once it's passed through the board, within 8 weeks, any associated regs should be updated. That's just sort of, if I was to give you my preferred amount of time.
Because in reality, the policy's not implemented until there's a regulation.
Yes, I think sort of the regulation is the roadmap of procedures that we would
There's a
follow.
what and.
Right, so I would say it's implemented, but I think the roadmap of procedures sometimes has to be refined. And in many cases, what we example of that, where we didn't have a regulation because the policy had basically both in it, so we had to pull it out. But I wouldn't want to suggest that absent a reg, the policy work isn't happening or it's not being implemented, because we're implementing the Title IX procedures, whether, as it is. So I would say 8 weeks would be ideal. I don't know I think we could hit that in most cases. It just depends.
I'd love to add language along those lines to the policy, and I would go a little longer than that to give staff, since to me 3 months is more than acceptable. I would support language along, the board seeks associated regulations to be
Updated within 12 weeks or
So,
3 months.
I'm going to suggest an alternative, and that in each policy that we create, there's a place for the board to direct the superintendent to implement regulations. It may be that it makes more sense on a policy by policy basis to direct the timeline for implementation, because we'll know coming into the change in policy what regulations we're going to need to look at, and so we'll be able to say, in this instance, we think we can get these regulations changes done inside of 6 weeks. Or it may be a circumstance like the anti-racism policy, which is policy 117 that Dr. Shergo referred to, that we're going to have to say, it's going to be 3 months isn't even going to be enough. We're going to need 6 months.
My struggle with that is the board has never been told that, right?
No.
There's never been, in my time on the board, we've never been told on any policy we've updated or passed, these regulations we can get updated very quickly. These regulations, that's never been part of the discussion.
So what I could do is add to the policy analysis form another question, and that question could be, what is the timeline for adjusting the associated regulations?
I think the question would be, do we have does a companion regulation exist? If not, does one need to be created, and what's the approximate timeline for creating that? And I think that's an important thing. And I think if you were looking for a compromise between what your initial interest was and what Mr. Blivis offered, what you could add is, if anything, to this existing policy development would be that the superintendent should provide the board regular updates on the development of associated regulations. I mean, it sort of could be part of the regular updates of the superintendent to the board on that work. But I think,
I like that language.
yeah,
It's-
just, that you
it's our
would
job
know,
is
yeah.
directing the supervising and directing
Provide
the
updates
superintendent.
on the work.
We just, in our policy state that the
Mhm.
superintendent will provide regular updates as to regulation development.
And that would be easy to do. Dr. Dyson, we have the RRC, which Mr. Blivis chairs, which is the Regulation Review Committee. And so we would be able to give you the agenda. It's got all the links. It's got all the red line. It's all there. So you'd be able to see, we just met a couple weeks ago. We did, 12.
On August 8th, we did 8 or 9 that were related to
117.
117, and on September 9th, we meet again to finish the work on 117.
Yeah.
117
You'd be able to see
related
our progress.
regulations.
I like that, because then it gives us specific updates on specific policy and regulation development.
Mhm. Okay.
So I like that.
I can incorporate language.
And then the cover page will add those questions. Do we have a companion regulation? And if not, what's the timeline to develop it or edit what exists?
Yeah.
Right, so you're adding this to the cover page, so it will be.
So you'll see that at policy committee.
Yeah, that'll be a part of the policy analysis that will once this is approved, that will accompany the policies. And we will, for the policies that this committee has already approved for the board, we're still going to be creating these analysis. So when it gets to the board for approval, the timeline will be there for them as well. You just won't get that sneak preview.
That sets much clearer expectations,
Mhm.
and yeah, I support that.
I like that.
Relatively easy to just add some language under 9E. Already a sentence in there about the superintendent will develop regulations.
Provide updates to the board. Yeah, no, I like that. Thank
Yep.
you.
Can we go for that?
Anything else on the board? Thank you. This has
Yeah.
been
That was
quite
good.
a process to go through, but I think we're in good shape.
All right, so subject to modifying the agenda posting language to match what's in the meetings policy, adding equity to the list of factors that are considered, and language, something to the effect of it is non-exhaustive and in no particular order, or some in alphabetical order, something to that effect. Updating the policy analysis form to address the regulations, and then adding language to 9B regarding the superintendent will provide regular updates on the regulations.
Yes, and I think you mentioned equity
Yes.
as one of the additional factors.
Yes.
Yep,
Yes.
go ahead.
So subject to making those insertions into this policy, this is ready to go back to the board for a second reading. So that brings us back to the meetings, to 106, item 106, which is the meetings. And really, this is more for information and discussion, just to debrief on how the change in the sign up went with the first meeting and how it is gone so far with the meeting today. Ms. Rich is not here with us this morning, but I can speak to it a little bit. I don't know, Dr. Shergo, if you're able to speak to it. The experience from the first week was very positive, or the first meeting was very positive. We had individuals who took advantage of the opportunity to sign up in advance. We had individuals who came and signed up the day of, and we had more than enough slots for everybody. The sign up process using the form went very smoothly. I can't speak to the passing of the list from Ms. Rich to President Johnson. I can't speak to that, but I understand it appeared to have gone well from the perspective of those in the audience, at least from my perspective in the
Read the
audience.
handwriting.
Yeah.
Because there
It was
is
tight. Right, exactly.
So, and the work that, and I'll call him out because he's here in the room, Dr. Lebo's team did in DTI and Ted Gardner to help get us the form set up was just tremendous. We were able to get what I think worked quite well.
Yeah, I mean, I would co-sign on that. I mean, I don't know that this process has truly been tested yet, because we sort of do have a lull at the beginning of the school year in terms of active engagement. I think tonight will be a different scenario. So I'm very eager to see how it looks tonight. But I think it's been clear, it's been publicized, it's being accessed. I actually don't know what Catherine has gotten in terms of pre-registration for tonight. I'll be curious. 5 people, right? So I think it's going to continue to serve us well. We haven't gotten any concerns about anyone's experience trying to sign up or engage. And I did note that there was ease of accessing and looking at the written comments on Board Docs. So for all intents and purposes, knock on wood, looks like we have a structure that will meet the interests of the board and the community at the same time.
The one improvement that I would note from the first session, because we know who the individuals are for that pre-register, I'm going to work with Ms. Rich about having those names listed in the, updated onto Board Docs, so they're listed in the agenda itself. If you look at other LEAs, they do that as well. So it's not, it wouldn't be an uncommon practice to do that. And I think that will just help facilitate that conversation. People will know who's going, what the order is. I think that's just a small process tweak that could be an improvement.
I wanted to confirm, it's probably in here, but I wanted to confirm, on a day like this, when we've had 5 pre-registrations, so it'll take about 15 minutes, will the additional time be available for same-day walk-ins?
All of the unused pre-registration time rolls into walk-in time.
And that's, I think, all of our understandings.
Except they have to still come in, go to the computer in the lobby.
Here.
Oh, it's here, we moved it back?
We did it
Okay,
back.
sorry, I'm not up to speed, but they still have to go and register. They can't just, it's not gonna be, President Johnson isn't gonna say, does anybody else wanna talk? They do actually have to fill out the form, even if they fill it out same day when they arrive.
Yes.
Yeah.
And maybe I'm not seeing it. I'm not sure if we fully note that in the policy. Is there it would be probably just one line, and maybe it's there and I'm not seeing it, where if all pre-registration slots are not filled, the remainder of the time is available for same day walk-in registration.
It's
Yes,
on page
it's-
4, item E,
E and F.
page 4.
And specifically F2, I think,
Mhm.
number 1.
Yeah, so in F2:1, 10 general public comment speakers shall be reserved for
Yes.
speakers who pre-register. If less than 10 pre-register, the remaining time will be allocated to same day. And then the same with the student slots.
Excellent.
Yeah,
That's
it's all right there.
excellent.
So, I mean, that I just wanted to do a quick debrief on how it went.
Dr. Sergo, I thought it went really well the first time. I do think it will be particularly tested in 2 weeks.
Mhm.
Might be tonight, but it'll be particularly tested in 2 weeks. So
I'm curious why 2 weeks in.
well, there's a planned protest.
Oh, okay. I guess I don't follow social media as much as I should. I don't know.
So whether they just decide to pre-register or if there's 15 walk-ins available, what will be,
Right,
how will that
right.
sort out as they're all trying to sign up for the available walk-in that might be more than 5.
Encourage everyone to pre-register
Well,
who's
Encourage everyone to
interested.
pre-register, but there will still be 5 slots available that night.
Up to 10, because if there are no student speakers,
Right.
that's an additional 5 slots.
I would
Yes.
suspect there may be students.
I imagine there will be.
So that'll actually be a great test on,
Yeah.
on that evening, and maybe this evening too. But
Mhm.
I thought that actually the last time was a good test because it
Right,
went
give us a
pretty
warm
seamless.
up, right,
It gave
it's
us
a
a
warm
little warm
up.
up without the pressure of,
Mhm.
a line.
They call it a hotel industry a soft opening.
Yeah,
That's right.
That's
That's
right.
right.
Like a
A little bit
restaurant.
of a soft opening. So I thought it was well done. I thought, yeah.
And I think we should have this conversation again in 6 months or so to see, once we've gone through the, an entire, half a school year, semester of board meetings, it would probably be good to have this conversation again.
Yeah, I don't know if we schedule it to be on the January or February policy committee. At this point, I think that's a good idea. I have a general question that either probably relates actually more to policy 101, but I wanted to bring it up just in case. I've brought an idea forward at different times that for leadership elections of the board, we should probably have some sort of forum where if someone wants to run for president or vice president of the board, that the board gets to ask them questions, in a either public forum or possibly in an administrative session, but that it's not fully behind closed doors. I think that would be more relevant to policy 101, right, which
Yes.
is organization of the board. But I wanted to make sure to ask it in case we think it would be more relevant to policy 102 meetings.
I think you're correct that it is more appropriately discussed as part of the organization of the board. Now, the 100 series policies are a ways away. We're about to finish 300, and then we'll start 400. But if 101 is a policy that this board wants to consider, I mean, the three of you as the committee can say we want to consider this, and we'll put 101 on the agenda for the next policy committee meeting. Or if two other members of the board at large want to have discussion about it, we'll follow that cue. Okay. So we'll put 101 on the agenda for the next policy committee meeting, which is September 27th.
Okay.
And I will put it on there as an information and discussion so we can hear what the thoughts of the board are, what it is you're looking for us to do, and then we can move forward with making some proposed revisions.
Yeah, that could be a great discussion. Thank you.
So one other thing, just quickly before we move off of 102, is the community listening session, which is also on our agenda for this afternoon's work session, to maybe expedite that conversation this afternoon because we have a heavy agenda. I don't know if there's some things that this group might like to propose in terms of consideration for the full board, in terms of some potential dates, scheduling, and our recommendations on, or do you already have some?
No, I think this is a good discussion only because I do worry that there may be some different interpretations of what these sessions are intended to do. Because I've heard some interpretation that these are essentially a sort of long public comment engagement because of the language of the policy. It sort of says that the sessions are informal meetings at which no board business will be conducted other than provide the public an opportunity to provide comments on matters of educational interest. But they're not intended, I don't remember the discussion being an intention to just have, 3 board members sit and listen to sort of a cascade of people coming up to mic. You want to engage with people. You want to have genuine conversation. You want to talk about topics of interest and celebration. So I do think there would be merit in sort of explaining that. And I don't know if that means that this policy needs any more tweaking. I know we're sort of trying to put it to bed, but I do worry that the interpretation to some may be that it's intended for you to listen to more public comment. It is, but it isn't, not in the same way that this public comment.
I guess that's not my interpretation, and we did have this discussion
Yeah.
during agenda setting yesterday.
Okay.
And here's the plan is that what I'm asking is, one, we establish a date. That's pretty much all we're doing tonight, other than also then establishing a board member as the point person to obtain input through email or conversations with the board of because like I have one particular idea of what I'd like it to be, but I'm one board member. So I think it's important that we hear from all of our fellow board members as to what they're comfortable with in that setting. Because the whole reason I came back from National Convention very excited about this opportunity. Well, what we have done though is we have put ourselves in a position here where we're promising 3 of these over the next school year. So the most important thing is we get a date, that the room's available wherever that is, but my proposal is the first one's here. And then we establish one board member who is the person who collaborates, brings in all the information from fellow board members about what are their thoughts and sharing how they picture the evening to be. Because I've shared
Right.
what I heard at the convention was, one is no one would be sitting up here.
Well, you're in the community, right? You're somewhere else.
But for ease of the first one, my proposal was we have it here. Let's have it in the boardroom, but let's set up the tables such that we're engaging with the community down on the floor of the boardroom. That's just how I picture it, and how when I talk to a couple of districts that were already doing it, it was, I don't want to minimize, but they called it speed dating.
Yeah.
They said it was basically speed dating, where community members went from board member to board member to board member to have a one-on-one discussion.
I just wanted to offer, so I've had some experience with this as well in my previous role. It was structured a little bit differently, and I just think sort of it's going to be important for the board to sort of marry all the different ideas. In my former role, these sessions were held in in the community at one of the schools, usually middle or high school. Typically
that's
in
our
the-
ultimate
right,
goal.
Typically in the media center, which
Yep.
already has sort of the warmth of setting and, you know, the table set up. And it would typically, leaders from the school would be there to welcome everybody to their school as a host. There might be light refreshments because sort of breaking bread is the greatest way to create that environment. And they share some highlights from their school. In the model that I have experience with, it was done by feeder. So if you're not doing it by feeder, this may not apply. But then there were identified individuals to speak to topics of interest in that community. It wasn't really a free-for-all in terms of talking about anything. There also was a clear understanding by those present that the board wasn't going to sort of take a list of all their issues and follow up individually. And so I do think it'll be important to manage people's expectations about what your role is. Do they expect you to be taking notes and follow up with them? I mean, how are we as a group, board leadership, system leadership, going to unpack what we hear? Because I think that that's important. If you're going to ask people for their opinion, what are we going to do with that information? So that would be just some insight to offer.
So,
And that's exactly why I wanted to
Yeah.
establish one person to gather all of that information from their fellow board members without turning, the point is, without turning tonight's discussion, we could talk about it for 2 hours.
yeah, well,
Which is not our intent tonight.
and that's one of the things that I wanted to comment on to you is that, you know, the discussion this evening does need to be focused, and there are things that you as a board can make decisions on and manage as part of the administrative function. So whether you choose to do it as a speed dating model or the model that Dr. Sergo described, or, you know, when I did something like this, when I worked for the DC Fire Department, it was done as a town hall where it was in a big auditorium with microphones set up, and somebody wanted to come up and ask a question, they walked up to the microphone. You know, so there's lots of different models that you can choose, and I think that can be decided internally. I don't know that that needs to be a part of the broader discussion, because we could spend 2 hours tonight.
Is that once we gather all this information, it could be an administrative function discussion that in order to put the meeting together, then put out the publication to the community so their expectations are set.
And it may,
You know, I picture something more, you know, intimate like that.
and
Like you said, media center, I want to get out to Thermal, Brunswick,
And
Urbana,
it-
you know.
it may be that one model doesn't work for every session. You know, that one session we go up to Thermont and maybe the media center model works well there, but we go to, you know, we do a virtual session and that's going to be a completely different kind of model. Or it could be, because you could have breakout rooms where people could go to talk to specific individuals.
I've done that too. I've done that model too.
Yeah.
Board members and breakouts.
Or, you know, or we do it, you know, maybe in Brunswick, it works better as a, you know, all the board members sitting together and everyone talking so everyone's hearing the same thing at the same time. I think we need to be open to figuring out the different ways that work for us and have the flexibility. And this, what we wrote into the policy gives us the ability to have that flexibility to do things maybe a little differently until we've worked out what actually really does work best.
I mean, I think it could be an evolving type of thing, but tonight, I just wanted to set the framework tonight.
I think that's
While
wise.
establishing a date
Yeah.
in the future that we could at least block the space, and
Mhm.
hopefully in that period of time between now and then, we could come up with a model that we'll use for the first one.
Mhm.
Like you said, it could vary. Who knows how the first one will go, and we'll see.
I will
See
say
how that
that if I was to give the board my best counsel on this, having done it for a long time, that when it works well, there are 3 main prompt questions that are offered to those who come. The first one is, tell us something that you love about your experience in FCPS that you want to celebrate. Because it enters us into this space of there are lots that's going well, acknowledging that not all that come out to engage come from that perspective, but you say, like, tell us something you love and you want to celebrate about your experience, because I think it's important that we honor and acknowledge those things so that we can protect them and we can deepen them as an organization. The second question is, if what is something that you think we should revisit or re-examine? And it sort of gives this broad way of inviting people to say, not the things that are the most broken, not the things that are failures or disasters in their mind, but the things that, you know, we could just make this a little bit better. Here's what it might look like for my child or my experience. And then the third question would be, what is something that you'd like to make sure the board knows and understands from the community's perspective? And when you sort of say, these are the 3 questions we're gonna ask, it does communicate sort of what the boundaries are of what you're hoping you'll accomplish, versus sadly, if you don't provide those anchors and those prompts, you are gonna have a very unmanaged dialogue.
No, we
So
have.
I just wanted to offer
We
that from my
absolutely have to
experience.
have guardrails
Yeah,
on,
yeah.
on direction of what our expectations are,
Absolutely.
because it could just turn into chaos.
I really, really like those questions. And Ray, it looks like you're noting all 3.
She got it.
No, I think that provides a perspective for a really productive conversation.
Mhm.
Are we looking now to think about some dates to propose to the board?
Do have a date, yes.
What day are you thinking
Of
about?
what we're gonna propose tonight. I'll have to double check my notes here. It's October 18th.
And if I might, I feel very passionate about this and I've had a lot of experience. Some things in the planning that I encourage the board to think about are language translation and childcare. Those are 2 barriers sometimes for community participation. And so as you are thinking about this an opportunity for our community, it would be something to consider. Childcare, great opportunity for SSL hours or other sort of things for our students, but language translation and childcare are 2 things that will even further communicate. We
I
want you to come.
particularly appreciate with your passion that you have volunteered to be the staff representative as we plan
Yeah.
this process. So I really appreciate that.
Thank
I'm
you.
glad we could get it on the record today.
Sure, certainly.
I'm taking notes.
This is what I get for always having
No,
an
I
idea.
really appreciate that. And I think that's great input, and it really kind of brings together in my vision of what I'd like it to look at. And we talk about equity and inclusion and allow, like we talked about that we had that one virtual policy committee meeting. And look at the people that logged on to talk about issues that weren't on the agenda, but that was their opportunity.
Right.
Where
Someone
was
from
she?
as far away as France. No, she was in
She was
France.
driving on a road in France.
I mean, I think that's a great perspective of trying to recognize like that as far as childcare and things like that we might be able to offer that gives them an opportunity to be here as well.
I like the October 18th suggestion. It allows not too much of the school year to pass before we have this first community session. Looking, and you probably looked at this, but there's no committee meetings, so I saw scheduled for that night. I do think we should consider having it at a school in the community.
100%. I just didn't want to put the pressure on however we plan this, particularly with Jeremy or anyone else who tries to, if we can do it, let's do it. I think that would be great. I love the intimate.
So this is not
setting.
technically a board meeting, so you're not recording it. There should be no need. I mean, there's a facilities impact, obviously, and certainly we'll have to talk with Dr. Lebo about sort of paying staff who maybe aren't scheduled to be there. You may need some different supports in that way, but.
I believe the question was actually sent to you about this, because there was a question.
About whether it's.
About whether if it has to be recorded or not.
It does not.
My
It's,
understanding is it does not.
no, I don't believe
But
that it does,
There
but
was,
that doesn't mean that.
President Johnson had a question. So,
Because the question was, because we're going to have we may have a quorum of board members, and are we enacting, are we subject to the Open Meeting Act because we're engaging the meeting of the board, but because we're not transacting any business of the board, it's not, and it's not subject to I don't believe it's subject to the Open Meetings Act. That said, if we have the ability to record them, like we would if we were here, and I can only assume that our crack IT team is able to do these kinds of things at our media centers. I don't know that there's a reason not to record and make that, that recording available.
It's just a different sort of energy and intention of it. It's not as right? Yeah.
Right.
Right,
So if you're doing
right.
it in a speed dating model, recording isn't necessarily going to work. But if you're doing it in we're going to have a town hall model where we have people with microphones.
Yeah. Because my understanding, I think in our very earliest discussions about this was that recording wasn't necessary. if we could just make sure we clarify that, because I know that
Yeah.
will be raised. I know that concern will be raised.
So it looks like this room is booked on that day from 8 a.m. to 4 p.m., but I think it is free in the evening. So if
That's
we,
my understanding, yes.
But it sounds like if you want to be in the community, you may be interested in looking at a
earlier.
school site.
Yes, yes.
I think that would be my preference as well.
Might as well. I just didn't want to have to commit to something, particularly when you think about it, October 18th will be here pretty quick. But I feel like we need to get one in the first semester. What my dates were thinking of was October, February, early May before graduation, which was one of Dr. Dyson's suggestions.
So we're meeting or later today, actually, but so we'll bring it up at our meeting, the chiefs meet midday, board meeting days, just to touch base on items. So we'll make sure we talk about it today and figure out the best way of helping you identify a potential option of location.
Okay.
Okay.
And my amazing team has just advised me that the CAC has the room reserved for a meeting for that evening.
We are aware. And they're going to talk to Mr. J about that.
Right.
Yeah.
It sounds like they may be able to keep that space, so if we're looking at a school site anyway.
Yes.
Yeah.
So yeah.
Okay.
But they may want,
But knowing that the CAC is meeting, does that change your interest in the date?
it changes my interest in CAC meeting on that day. Because that just came up, that
Yeah.
he actually just made that request.
Online, it looked that their October meeting was October 3rd.
Yeah,
They probably what you would see.
Yeah, well, we knew yesterday that he had requested the 18th, he just requested it.
Okay, so we'll stand by.
We were gonna have a discussion about whether that had to happen.
Gotcha.
So we have somewhat tangented from the intention of the debrief on the public comment piece of 102, but certainly important discussion that we've had. Do we have anything further to talk about, or are we ready to move on to policy 200?
Ready?
Okay, so for policy 200, I'm going to invite Dr. Lebo and his team to come join us at the table and let them lead the discussion. This is another information and discussion item, so we can get some feedback from the committee as to what the board's interest is with respect to making revisions.
Good morning. Thank you all for coming.
Absolutely. Good morning, and thanks for having us. Obviously, you know us, Paul Lebo, and then I'm Amin. And I was really thinking that this was a conversation piece, so we could hear what the board's desires were, then kind of come back with some possible recommendations, and didn't know if there was anything explicit in the existing policy that you'd like us to explore further. We could certainly provide you our perspective and professional expertise, but didn't want to go down a road unless we had some clear guardrails from the board as to what some of the initial thoughts were about the policy and things you would like staff to consider related to modifications.
So on page 2, right, we have the board shall consider the following factors. I didn't necessarily expect to see student demographics listed there. And so I wonder how wide a scope the board can have in that, both in terms of concentration of poverty and also racial and ethnic backgrounds.
So what has historically, and so thank you for asking that question, because if you were going to ask me, I was going to say staff would really enjoy some clarity about the factors there, because we believe we have operated under the intent of the board for many, many years, but it is not explicitly called out in many of these factors. And so I think that would be helpful for the policy revision for the board to provide clear expectations as to what they mean by any of these terms. So as an example, I'll just choose one and then I'll get to your question, Mr. Bass. Educational welfare of students. What really does that mean? Certainly our instructional partners, that's what they do. That's their role, and that's what they strive for in everything. And so as we consider that, what really, how do we quantify that for the board as we analyze the moving of boundaries? And so Mr. Bass, specifically, what historically has been done is we understood the direction of the board student demographics really looked at a number of things, one of which is our multilingual learners and being able to identify our total number of multilingual learners in any given attendance area to make sure that our schools have the appropriate resources to meet all of the needs of our students. Historically, we had a centralized program. We've now decentralized that. And so it's just one of the factors that we know our schools need to make sure that they have resources in place to meet all of the needs of our students. And so that's one of the characteristics and demographics that we look at. Another demographic that we look at specifically are students eligible for free and reduced meals. And again, making sure that it is an indicator of poverty, and that is one that we want to make sure that schools are resourced and we have proper resources in place. We have not, and that has not been a direction of the board to look at racial and ethnic composition of students. That is not something that has ever been a factor for staff to consider.
What about student achievement, like data around?
That has not been a factor that we have considered.
Because I had this, I'm glad he brought it up, because it's a question about looking to staff. I don't really understand some of the factors. And so I was gonna ask the experts if you saw a more, clear number of factors that we should be addressing, because as we're learning through this process in our county, it's going to be important in the future. And I didn't understand the demographics. I didn't understand academic performance. I don't understand what that has to do with, are we picking who's the best? And I don't really understand those criteria that we're placing upon you. So I would like feedback back to us saying, here's, as we are the ones who do this, here are the factors, one, that we see and the ones that we consider, and the ones that, we have to admit that geography is the primary issue when we talk to families.
Mm-hmm.
So how do we incorporate those things within the geography of that type? And one of the other things that's been brought up by some other board members just in passing is that, do we need to start beginning the conversation that there just aren't such things as feeder patterns anymore, that our growth is just not going to accommodate making that a priority. So I kind of leave that to you. That's a long question to leave to you.
And so certainly jump in anytime you want. A couple of really good questions and thoughts in there. And so the idea of a feeder pattern is an interesting one, and you really kind of hit the nail on the head. We've had historical concepts of what feeder patterns are, but the reality is, with a few exceptions, we do not have pure feeder patterns throughout the district. We don't, that's not the way the composition of our elementary, middle, high school number of schools works. And so there are many, many schools who feed to multiple other schools. And so that has always been a challenge for us when we talk about established feeder patterns. It's almost inconsistent with doing an attendance area modification to try to keep established feeder patterns. Now, certainly, I think common sense would say that we wouldn't say east side of the county is not going to go completely to the west side of the county. That just doesn't work for a whole host of other operational issues. It also decreases engagement for families, if they're not, in somewhat close proximity to their school. But the other reality is we have really large attendance areas, and we have really small attendance areas. And I'd just like to point to two really quickly because it can kind of put the visual for you. If you pull up the Liberty attendance area, Liberty Elementary, it's one of our largest attendance areas, but it's one of our smallest schools. We barely have 250 students. If you look at Hillcrest, it's 100% non-transported, except for our students who need special education transportation. And it's a small, tiny little dot on a map because of the density. It's a more urban community, right? And so we are going to have, given the size of our county, some areas that are not sort of next to their school. And in other cases, you do have that because we just have the density. Again, we release another one. It's a school built for 1,000 students, and relatively speaking, it has a small attendance area to fill those seats. So we agree and would like the opportunity to come back to the policy committee with some thoughts on removal of that language and really being consistent on the building of school communities. I think we have some ideas. I know we've talked to some of our instructional partners about building that school community. As it relates to impact on neighborhoods and communities, what staff's interpretation based on a long history, I think when this was last revised in 2003, was that really meant making sure there was a robust plan to welcome and accept students that changed. And if you look back historically, our principals and centrally through their instructional directors have put robust plans in place to how do we build this new community, whether it's an existing school that just is accepting new students, or it's a Blue Heron that's accepting an entire student body of new students. And that's one of the things that has been staff's interpretation for almost 2 decades, but it's not explicitly called out. And so I think we do need to have a better job. So for all of us many years from now, when there's new board leadership and there's new central leadership, you're not coming in sort of cold, like, what does that really mean? So I think there's some real value in those 11 factors. I do think from our perspective, I would encourage the board to keep that note at the bottom that none of these can be in priority order, because to your point, Mr. Rose, that given our growth, it's almost impossible to hit all of these factors. Transportation is another great one. Operationally, we would love to maximize walkers. That's good for a community, but there are times when having anybody who is physically within the walkable area of a school, if they all walk, we'd be at 200% capacity. So we just can't do that. And so I think that's a good clarification for staff. That has been one that we've routinely talked about with the board and the public. There's lots of factors, and we do consider, and we have these discussions, and if we can answer the question for the board, well, why did you talk about moving potentially a community that right now all walks? Well, all the schools at 150% capacity, and we believe that the board's direction to staff was that we needed to better balance enrollment. So that we thought that was the best approach to do that. I think it facilitates a better conversation.
That's what I often, as we all do, speak from personal experience. And I know it's a little bit of a different scenario when you're opening a brand new school, but I can speak to, my kids were redistricted 5 times, and the most significant one was the opening of Oakdale High School. But in that case, a brand new school, the administration there really, really focused on community, on bringing those students together with a sense of community in that school, building school pride and acceptance that there were kids coming from Linganore, Urbana, TJ, and bringing them all together. And I remember that distinctly, that there was numerous conversations between not only the principal and his staff with the students, but with the community and all of the staff there. That's what we're doing here. We're building a sense of community that everyone belongs, everyone's welcome, that type of thing. So I can speak from experience about how a focus on that can even transfer to when kids are being redistricted into an existing school, about that focus of all staff on board, that we're welcoming students from a past feeder pattern, but in building that sense of community within that. And then the other side of that, because this is the one we get a lot of, is then when they go from a perceived feeder pattern to the high school level and they end up at a different high school. So that, because the same thing, Windsor Knolls. Windsor Knolls was a great example of, some of the kids went to Linganore, some of the kids went to Urbana. So, building that perception of community and that type of thing.
I'm really, I'm glad we're going to look at these factors. I think it's, been the start of a good conversation. I'm really intrigued on the, on concentration of poverty. I think there's been 1 or 2 conversations, maybe with say Leslie Pellegrino, where I'm coming to understand that at one time, a lot of funding, maybe from the state, was directed toward concentration of poverty in a particular school. But I think now this is can be more countywide or specific to each student. And so if I'm understanding this correctly, there's an opportunity for, do we want to, are there negative academic outcomes when there's a very, very high concentration of poverty in one particular school, rather than students, families who are struggling economically being more represented throughout many schools? And so my understanding is at one time, I would say there was like almost a perverse effect where we needed a certain concentration of poverty in order to get certain funding, but I don't think that's the case anymore. And so is there opportunity for
Yeah, it still is.
So still is, and it's still by school.
by school?
Correct.
That's how Title I is established.
And
There's
even
no
the
changes with this on.
and the concentration of poverty grants, really, it's about the school's enrollment and socioeconomic composition. And that would be one thing, if the board wanted to have a broader conversation, I certainly think we would want to involve our community schools coordinator and team on that. A little outside of my lane, but I can speak as being part of her collective team on providing supports through community schools. It's really a very unique time in Frederick County. They're really doing some cool things with some of the funding that they're able to do, and really provide some very unique services for not only our students, but long-term it'll eventually be for our families. So things like health center opportunities, and other community services. So that would be a worry of mine if we had a factor that said, let's try to better balance poverty, as an example, that we would reduce our ability to respond to the collective needs of our community. And we
That
would be-
particular geographic area of the community, because we would diminish the percentage of free and reduced meal students, and therefore our opportunities for grants and Title I funding.
Yeah, I'll follow up after this meeting and just with an email, just to, I don't know, kind of double confirming that there haven't been changes on these funding, to really know what we can consider and not.
Well, the blueprint is relaxing the percentages.
I think there's a confusion between two things. So the blueprint requires that we track our funding to the level of the student, right? So that's where 75% of our funds must be tracked to the level of the student. That is separate and distinct from how then that's sort of collapsed into there's a lot of research on the positive effect of community schools, which is why it's in the blueprint. So I would be very cautious about suggesting we make any modifications to that, because the blueprint requires we provide very robust services for students who are living in poverty. And the way in which Ms. Pellegrini is talking about the tracking of that is sort of how we ensure that that money is going to that student in that school. They're sort of separate. One is a sort of a budgeting and accounting feature that the blueprint requires, that money goes to the individual child. But then it's also, there's a separate body of work, which is around Pillar 4, which is in the blueprint around resources to support students. And that's sort of where this community schools work lives.
And sorry if I may, we just, had a long conversation, series of meetings with IAC about, the revise of the gross area baseline and some of the funding, that additional funding that we can get in the gross area baseline for individual school buildings, that the allowable square footage can also increase based on
Correct.
on the concentration of poverty and the community school number. So there is additional funds available that the IAC would consider as we request funding for schools that have community-based services, that would allow us to get additional square footage for buildings, because they are providing those services to the community.
And I think that I'm glad he brought this up, because it brings up a broader conversation around the blueprint and what the blueprint's trying to address in that regard. Because I've always made the point that, let's say the student goes to Waverly and they're receiving Title I supports, community school supports, but let's say that same student on the same level of poverty happens to go to Urbana Elementary.
Mm-hmm.
They should have access to the same services.
And they don't.
and they don't.
Right.
So that's a broader discussion that we need to have with our partners.
Thank you. Understand it a little more. I think I will follow up with a couple questions. I had some suggestions on language, but I don't know if there were more substantive.
Under the same section, or do you have other, are you in the same section?
No, even earlier in the policy. It's two language suggestions, so if either of you have anything more substantive, I would.
My questions or comments really start falling under the redistricting study process and then our communication with our community engagement. So if you have things that are higher.
Okay,
yes, we can.
Sure, quickly on the second sentence, with the board acknowledging that schools are foundations of the community and have a lasting impact on its citizens. Acknowledges sounds like negative, or that we're pushed into it. And I don't know, maybe we'd be more, the board asserts that schools are the foundation of the community. And I wonder if we say have a lasting impact on students' lives, right? Not all of our students are American citizens. So we may want to use a different word than citizens, maybe students' lives. So that's one possibility. The board asserts that schools are the foundation of the community and have a lasting impact on students' lives. There's one possible language change. The other language change I was thinking about is, I think on page 3 at the bottom, whether we may not want to use the word grandfathering. It's I think it's really been, I think it was initially used in the Jim Crow South to continue voting patterns for white people whose grandfathers could have voted maybe before Reconstruction. So that sentence, I think, would have the same intention if we said the board will consider allowing students who are entering their final year in a school, i.e. 5th, 8th, and 12th graders, to continue in their current school if space is available.
Have we always adhered to that specificity? Because I know personal experience, when Oakdale opened, all 11th graders were allowed to stay at Urbana.
So as it is worded now, the interpretation by the board and staff has been that is truly at the pleasure of the board at every individual redistricting decision. And so in my time, it's been different. The board has made a different determination in every redistricting that
I wonder, should we not strike that? I mean, that we're not living up to that language. 5th, 8th, and 12th, we're not living.
Well, I do think it says consideration.
Yeah.
It doesn't say we will do it, it says we will give consideration.
But it says to students entering 5th, 8th, and 12th. Well, that's not true. We will give consideration to those entering 11th, 7th.
And then the last one, it was
4th.
10th, 11th, and 12th.
Right. So I'm just saying, should we just strike that and we will give consideration and waiver status to students depending on
Space availability.
space available?
We
Because I know we're not doing that.
You're saying that we've been more expansive or
yeah.
less?
And we've been both.
We've been
The board-
both.
the board's
Yeah,
been
we-
more
we-
and
like I
less.
said, we don't have space. Sorry, all of you have to go. Or we have space. You get to stay.
Yeah. Broadly speaking, though, I think there's real good, it's really good if a kid is entering their last grade in a school to give as much consideration as we can for that kid, that family, where if they have 2 or 3 grades coming, I think, I don't know, to me, it makes sense that if there's a redistricting happening, that for 2 or 3 grades at the new school, maybe they do need to be redistricted.
But I
you can-
speak from, again, I try and look at a parent perspective. I had great gratitude that my son was able to stay for his junior and senior year. I look at it from a different perspective. I felt that once he had already done freshman, sophomore, that it was really important that he have the opportunity to stay at his home school, which they were. So I have that different perspective where
You could probably split the difference between them and include language that adjusted so the language is will give consideration to allowing students to remain in their school pending space with prioritization given to
Yeah.
5th, 8th, and 12th
Yeah.
grades.
Yeah, I was just addressing it because I don't want to place undue
Mhm.
restrictions upon you by saying 5th, 8th, and 12th when we haven't. We've looked at each individual. I would like to continue that. I don't want future boards.
Mhm.
I guess I'm trying to always look at things 8 years from now.
Mhm.
We want a future board to say, well, we're only considering 12th graders. I want consideration to be given, potentially, if space allows, if the situation allows. I want consideration to be given to situations like that.
So, in terms of the item D, redistricting study
Mhm.
process, I think particularly as we've gone through the current redistricting, or however we're referring to it at this point, item 4 has come up as a concern, so the developing a variety of school attendance boundary options. Can we maybe dig into that a little bit as we're thinking about revising this policy too? I don't know if there's a specific number of options that would be possible or desirable from your perspective or from us, but I think that's come up as a concern in the current Crestwood redistricting. We've seen one option, is that correct, and we're working on
And three alternatives to
Three
get that
alternatives.
out, yeah.
so I don't know if we can refine that language, or from your perspective, what might feel better from the community side as we're going through the study process.
And so this is, it's an interesting question on the number of options. And if you can kind of walk through this with how my brain's going to work on this one a little bit. What I can tell you is what we've experienced when you take too many options to the community, it becomes very difficult to actually get specific feedback that staff and frankly the board could possibly take sort of action on. What we found is less options allows the community and staff and the board to really focus on an area to say, now wait a minute, in this option, what if we looked at moving a planning block from here to here, and could we consider the demographic impact? The problem was when you have, I'm going to throw a crazy number out, 10, sort of all of those options are already on the table, and then you get this sort of smattering of, oh, could you take from option 8 and move this piece to option 2? And it's like a puzzle that really you can't put together ever. And when staff operated on this one was based off of what we did with the Waverly and what we thought the direction from the board was, is, well, let's take an option and a recommendation to the community and get good feedback on there. And what we conveyed, although I don't know that it was always received, was this: I can promise you this is not going to be what the board approves. While it is the recommendation, and it was what staff believed with Dr. Dyson's approval to be a solid plan, we know that there's going to be tweaks, but we have to have a starting point to have that conversation. Having said that, I do wonder if that does have an unanticipated consequence when there is a lot of potential community impact, is it does feel like it's sort of being forced, even though that was never the intent. And so I wonder if we should put language of, although I was going to say at least 2 options, but then I worry that he says at least, so, should we do 5? I think 2 are reasonable. Then you also start to get dependent on the scope of the redistricting. Frankly, in some cases, you might not really be able to get 4 valid options. And so is that pretty disingenuous too? Because I'm going to put an alternative or an option out there, but board, it's an option, but staff really doesn't think it's a good idea. Does that make sense? Sorry.
The development of the of options and the number of options really should be driven, I think, by the board's priorities. And if the board lays out to Dr. Lebo and his team, our priorities are A, B, C, and D, then Dr. Lebo and his team can come up with an appropriate number of options that address those priorities. And I think that to try and set in stone, well, we're going to have at least 5 or we're going to have at least 10 I'm not sure that that's going to produce fruitful work.
I appreciate this conversation, and I really agree with what you're saying, because whether it was our failure to properly communicate what this paragraph actually says, particularly the last sentence, 2 sentences, or it was the community's failure to hear, you never know. But I think it's really key that the proposed options, regardless of what we present to you during those the proposed options will be revised and presented to the school communities. Doesn't matter if we present, and that gives me better perspective for what you are attempting to do, is that, yes, if we give them 5 options, it makes your work, our work, just that much more difficult, because there'll be a plethora of, oh, I have a comment on option 5. I have a comment on option 3.
Yeah.
I agree that 2, because of that primary sentence there, is that, like you said, is we probably should have opened every meeting with, I can absolutely guarantee you what we're presenting tonight will look nothing like we'll eventually be prepared, because this is a conversation opener in that we're establishing what the priorities are, what the board established priorities are, what the needs are of our students, our community, and our staff, and our capacity. And so tonight, we're going to open the conversation with some proposals. And these proposals, again, will look nothing like the final, because your engagement is important to us. And I think we didn't do a very good job of communicating that, or again, maybe they didn't hear it, but I don't think we do. And so I think it always goes back on us, is that we could do a better job of communicating to them that their input, regardless of how many options we present to you, is important. I think the same thing happened in our discussion with Middletown.
Yep.
A lot of that was just all about miscommunication, mishearing, is that we always put our best within the parameters of what we face, their best interests at heart. We're always listening. And so I think I appreciate that conversation, that's good input, that the more options we present, it creates a muddled group of feedback. And so maybe we need to be clearer in our policy. It's kind of almost like when we use the disclaimer on public comment, we try to be very clear. So why don't we have a clear disclaimer that we start every discussion about redistricting with, that says, we're going to present this many proposals to you, maybe only 2, but rest assured that your input to us is of the utmost importance, and that the current proposals we present tonight will look nothing like what will ultimately be, just always have a disclaimer on every redistricting process that says how important the community feedback is to us, regardless, because that's what everybody focused on. Everybody focused on the superintendent's recommended redistricting. Said, look, and they did.
Yep.
Look at that. They've already decided. And we needed a disclaimer that say,
And when
it probably shouldn't even have said recommended. It should have said proposed. The superintendent's proposed redistricting. And because language, I think David's done a good job of pointing out how words matter sometimes in these policies.
And when we revised the policy, if you look at 200.0, which is the very first section, that is a policy statement. This is one of the few policies that actually included a true policy statement. And it does not really emphasize the role of the community the way this board wants it to. And so one of the things that we will do, the very statement you're describing that maybe needs to be at the start of every conversation, needs to be included in this policy. And it will be a part of the revision to this when we have a draft of something to present to you.
And I think that makes your job much easier instead of being constantly targeted as, oh, you're just, like you said, you're just trying to ram this down our throats. I think if we set the stage from the very get-go, it makes everybody's expectations and job easier.
Could I ask the board's pleasure specifically about the process? And this is just from my lens, but I know it's something that Molly and the team and I have talked about. The way the process is set up, and we don't have an issue with this necessarily. I just want to make sure that the board is still comfortable. When this was written, certainly the day of email and social media was not as prevalent as it is today. And so we staff go out to the community and we do our best to encourage feedback to staff so we can revise and be able to present various options to the board. But it seems like some of this is shift and it's sort of automatically everybody goes to the board, but you haven't even had the opportunity to see it. And so again, if that's just sort of the day and time where we are and you're okay with that, but it feels like it's almost putting the board in a somewhat awkward spot because we've gone out to the community, you're now getting feedback. Staff isn't getting feedback, even though we're the ones working on it, and you haven't had a formal presentation. Does that see where my question is? I just want to make sure we have everything in order. So again, somebody doesn't feel left out or we're not communicating.
But what would you suggest instead?
So I guess the question is, are we okay with the current order where staff goes out and the board is going to receive feedback that you might not necessarily have gotten the full picture because staff hasn't done a formal presentation? Or would the board's pleasure be come to the board first with the options that we're going to take to the community just for an awareness?
That would be my pleasure, yes.
I think so. And I mean, I think to your point too, I mean, there's definitely some language in here about how we're communicating with the communities around public notification of the meetings and hearings. But I mean, we've also established a specific email address for redistricting comments, and maybe that's something that we'd like to include, as part of our general practice, is that the board receives this initial presentation on what the options and the preliminary recommendations might be, that an established email address is set up for all communication that the board receives and staff receives, and then we work through the rest of the communication. But I did have questions about the notification. I mean, it references written notification in 2 newspapers, and regular electronic and written communication, but there is no mention of social media. This isn't.
So that's on the closure process. Yeah. So that is not part of this 200.2.
No.
So, but you're right. And that's actually from the law. Yes. Still says you have to do 2 newspapers.
Well, maybe we could add some additional language around electronic communication.
Right.
Yeah, I mean, we can certainly,
You still have to have the town crier.
right, yes.
Present.
But on both the redistricting process and on the closure process, and just because the redistricting or the closure process has requirements because the law sets the requirements for us, that doesn't mean that those requirements can't be imported into the redistricting to say that we will also publish electronically through our social media on our website, in the same way that Dr. Lebo was saying, this was written in an earlier version of our world.
Can I talk real quick about his question about presenting it to us first?
Oh, sure.
I just wanted to address that. The way I look at that is, we talked about, that's almost like a soft opening for you guys. You present it to the board without the pressure of the community will probably be here, but the community, it's not an action item, so the community can public comment, but they wouldn't be able to. It would be your opportunity to kind of do the presentation. And I think we'd have set criteria that our input would be limited to, hey, here's a better way to present that, but not give input on changing it. This is what we're going to present to the community. At a later date, once we've gotten their input, we're going to present to you again, and you can provide feedback. But how we set up, this is what we're going to present to the community. We wanted you to be, information only, but know what's going to be presented at next week's first community thing.
One of the few times that focus will be on form and not substance.
Yes, exactly. So
And
does that make sense to you? Would
That's,
that be a preference?
from staff's perspective, yes.
Okay.
I'm glad you said that was your preference, because that was, staff was leaning that way. It just has felt awkward to.
Yeah, because it feels awkward that it put us in a position that we felt like we were in competing camps, that you didn't want to present it to us first, and you did, and we won it first.
Agreed. And I do like, from staff's perspective, that ability, and we'll be back on the 27th to meet, the requirements of number 6, of having a dedicated part of the work session to have a more conversational. We've gone out to the community, we've gotten feedback, this is what staff is hearing, and then for the board to kind of say, well, now wait a minute, how can we be responsive and still meet all of our needs associated with the policy? That has always been the intent, from as we understood it, of the secondary work session, but we never had the formal upfront.
Yeah.
So
Because that
I
has
think
been
it's
a
much
difficult
better.
conversation for us, because I can't tell you how many times I've been stopped in the community, and all I've had to say is patience. Patience. We haven't even gotten the presentation yet, so just some patience. We're I've tried to focus on that. We're taking your input and we're going to apply, but it would be great if we already had the presentation and we would have some, substantive talking points to be able to say, yeah, I agree with you there. Give that feedback. Go to the community and give that feedback. That type of thing. So I agree. Let's change that.
I have it in my notes.
This is one of those policies I really look forward to it fitting into the new form.
Yeah.
Mhm.
Because it seems like it's really wordy. There's a lot there that we could probably trim.
Well, and I'd like to just make sure that within this redistricting study process, that we're more specific and defined on how we're communicating with the community and getting the information out. I mean, it's in there in terms of the community engagement plan shall include a variety of engagement strategies, but just being very specific that when we're holding our work session, when we're holding our public hearing, when we're taking final action, that we emphasize how we're communicating with the community, making sure that nobody feels blindsided if they don't understand what the time frame is. So
Mhm.
What I do like, to your point, if we come to the board first, we're able to also articulate that, because while that has always been a part of the process, it's again, seems sort of backwards, right? We have it as part of the process, it's what guides what we do, but there hasn't been sort of a public discussion ahead of time to outline.
Yeah.
So I think that,
Always felt like it was like the appeal process, like we weren't allowed to hear anything yet because we were going to make the decision. And I was like, why are we in the dark? So thank you for that. I appreciate it.
could I ask for clarity? I know President Johnson in her comment that kind of asked us to come to policy, there was a discussion of what would trigger a redistricting. And so didn't know if the policy committee had any specific thoughts around the 5 elements under 200.2-A. Just want to make sure we're being responsive to what I thought I heard President Johnson talk about maybe having more specific language about what would trigger it. I think this is sufficient enough to meet our needs, but I just want to make sure we're meeting the intent of the board. So I wanted to ask for clarity, because I think, what has prompted, this is an example, there's a renovation, right?
but it's renovation and some.
And additional, so-
enrollment and capacity, right?
But was there specific numbers that the board wanted us to include there?
Well, I'm curious, when, we have a lot of schools that are over state rated capacity. It would be whether it's specifically noted or not, it would be interesting to see how much over state rated capacity is prompting then a redistricting, and how many years over state rated capacity, I think how many years before it prompts a redistricting.
So it's a great question, because I'm thinking, let's use Green Valley as an example, right? It is significantly over capacity, but we got a project in the works. Staff certainly I wouldn't want to recommend a redistricting right now, because while not ideal, we're able to manage it with portable classrooms. And then, so when they move in, they'll be fine in their new facility. And so I wonder if, and it might not be language for here, but when we look at the policy review related to the EFMP, do we need to include as part of that broader discussion with the board, just an analysis of where we are from a state rated capacity perspective, it's just a trigger point to say, should we have a conversation about a redistricting in the upcoming year, given our 10-year projected enrollment as well as our 10-year projected capital improvement plan. That might be a better time to at least formalize that we have an annual conversation
Right.
about it, and from the
What
board's
triggers a
lens.
discussion versus a redistricting?
But so we have to come to the board anyways annually for that. Do we just include that as one of the factors we talk about? Right now, staff doesn't see any need, but we do want to talk about, here's where we are from a capacity perspective. Here are all the projects we have in the queue. Does the board want to entertain a broader conversation about a possible need for redistricting?
So you would place that in that discussion rather than as part of the policy in your opinion?
In my opinion, because it still meets these factors, it doesn't change any of the factors, but especially now given our growth, it sort of reemphasizes this need to have it on the forefront of everybody's mind that growth is going to continue to create the need. I mean, if you think about it, in the 10-year period, you mentioned the Oakdale opening, that was the last redistricting prior to 2017. So we talked almost a decade of no redistrictings. And in the last 6 years, we're going on 4. So it's.
Well, and I think it was part of our discussion with the FMP this year as we were looking at where our priorities were and looking at where we're going to need new facilities built. And I think we all see a lot of redistricting in our future, unfortunately. But
So yes, that'd be a great, to add that to the discussion.
So to answer your question, I mean, I think that this list of 5 factors is specific and also broad enough for help guide, in my opinion.
I agree. Yeah. Perfect. Yep. Oh, I agree. Yeah.
Anything else?
We talked about the rest of it with 200.3. We didn't see it. Most of that is really in compliance with state law. Anyways, the language is clear to staff, and we don't see a need for any modifications there. But certainly, if the board had something you wanted to look at more closely, we could.
Only, I mean, I think as long as the board is following this policy when it comes up, then it seemed pretty comprehensive to me. The only note I had was around the public notification in the newspaper and just maybe adding some additional language for social media and other avenues to make sure that people are aware.
Maybe most specifically, the find out first, right? Will be as important as an important part of the notifications.
It's just making sure that we are notifying as much and as many ways as possible. But otherwise, I didn't have any other comments on that section.
Yeah, I think that goes to being, notification and direct people away from whatever we title it. That it impacts you, whatever we call it.
And I will, as part of the review of this policy, we'll verify that there hasn't been changes in the state law, because eventually the state law will catch up to the world we live in now and not necessarily require just publication through the local town crier, or the back of the local business journal.
The yellow pages.
Many of our students wouldn't have that reference. They wouldn't know what that means.
Yeah, that's great.
Like, we're-
Yeah.
All right, we'll get
So,
to work.
we'll look forward to having you back as we continue to develop the updates to this. So
Appreciate
thank you all.
Thank you.
Thank you. So that, I think, brings us to our last substantive item on the agenda, which is policy 317, royalties and copyright. This is another information and discussion item. It's a relatively short policy. The focus of the policy is basically to say that if you're an employee and you develop something, it belongs to the board. You write a book, it belongs to the board. You create a manual, it belongs to the board. You create a process for instruction, belongs to the board. That's basically what this says. I would like to hear if there's more that you'd like to come out of this. I do think that the title may need to be redone because there's another policy that addresses the use of copyrighted works. And I think that there is that there may be some overlap there or some confusion about which is which and what is each is for. So I think we may consider retitling this policy in some way. But I'd love to hear if the board has interest in doing more with this. I will say, and Mr. Bass, I know you're ready to jump in. As we've over time, we've seen individuals move into this world where we have more than one function in our lives. Gig economy, people take on other jobs, and I am certain, without a question of doubt, that there are staff members who are taking the experience and knowledge they have and doing things with it in other ways. And I think one of the things the board has to think about is how much restriction and control does the board want to take over that additional work? And I don't know what the answer to that is. I don't sit here with an answer for you, but I think I'm not sure that the policy as written really considers that we might have staff members who are talented writers and want to write a book about education, and whether that really should belong to the board or not. Because the way the policy is written now, I think it would. But maybe
that is
shouldn't.
the concern that we have heard from employees, and I guess my question is that a previous perhaps misinterpretation of this policy, or is that what the policy is intended to communicate? Because the way that it's written is if it's done on board time or as part of their duties. But the idea that I develop expertise in a particular, and I'm not, by the way, I'm not writing a book, so this isn't personal, but the idea that I can become an expert on something and deepen my interest, and I might pursue that on my own time, but maybe my interest originated because of my exposure or experiences as an FCPS employee. I do worry that this policy, as it's been previously interpreted, suggests to people that if you go and write a book about something that you develop an interest or expertise in, you can't publish it because it belongs to the board. And that is the message that some of our employees have gotten historically. And so we either need to clarify whether or not that's accurate, if that's what this policy is intended to do, or we need to clarify the interpretation.
So line, between the first sentence, to me, that the important point in there is as part of their official duties. So I would assume that a person, maybe it's a wrong assumption, but I would assume that a teacher is not writing a book as part of their official duties.
No, this would be, maybe someone just, I'm making this up. Maybe you're a special education teacher. You've had a lot of experiences over the years working with dysregulated children, and you decide to write a book for parents about behavior support structures that you've seen work. And maybe you do research and you interview people. So I think it's that idea of I've developed this interest and expertise associated with my official duties because I work as a special education teacher, but I'm not writing on the time and I'm not writing about trainings I've received as an employee. It's sort of, you see what I'm saying?
But at the same time, there could be a circumstance where an employee, works with a certain set of curriculum, sees a gap in that curriculum, and creates something to fill that gap. And to not only to fill that gap, but with the intention of making it a part of the instructional materials that they use and get shared with other teachers. So, I think both scenarios are potentially possible.
And honestly, if you were to ask where the policy gaps here, from my perspective, this would be right for a similar process that we use with the ethics panel, which would be that we would ask employees who have any questions about this, just ask for an advisory opinion. Right? So we do that with the ethics panel, where if somebody's worried they have a conflict of interest, or they're saying, is this permissible? There's a gray area here. They ask for an ethics panel advisory opinion. in some ways, I see that being there's a link there, right? Because we're saying, is this a conflict of interest? Am I violating the conditions of my employment? I don't think that's an appropriate use of the ethics panel, but perhaps that might be a place that you could consider policy language to refer questions about this policy interpretation to that group.
I think this is too restrictive. And yeah, whether we are encouraging people to get opinions from an ethics panel, but as we look to recruit the very best teachers and have them stay with FCPS for many years, people are going to develop expertise that they, I want them to have the right to use that expertise for the world, but also for their own, for the economic benefit that can come from that. I think this policy is too restrictive, and it feels like it also speaks to a different time, right? That this was adopted in 2005.
Almost 20 years ago.
Yeah.
And I wonder, like you talked about, is it that the interpretation is almost too, because I mean, Ms. Gallagher pointed out, it says produced on board time or as part of their official duties, and then it goes on to say if performed in partially on public or private time. I don't see any way where if someone chose, just because they became an expert thanks to their experience with us, and maybe the 7 years they spent in Montgomery County, and then they wrote a book in the summer and put that book up for sale, how we'd have any right to the royalties and copyright of that material. On your other point, though, I do see, let's say they're a curriculum writer, and maybe they personally, because of their talents, write a curriculum that feeds into, and then later decided, maybe I'll try and sell this curriculum to Talbot County. I think that's different.
Mhm.
I think they wrote that as part of their role as a curriculum writer or a member of our curriculum team that fed into our curriculum. And I can see where that would be a conflict of interest. You don't go out and sell that
Right.
on your own. But the scenario of writing a book just because you gained experience from your work life on your own time, and that interpretation that we would have any right to that material just seems totally way out there.
Yeah.
Well, and to your point, we don't actually have a conflict of interest policy. And so that's a policy gap that I noted over the last year that tends to govern stuff like this. So a conflict of interest policy would govern this. It governs things like tutoring students who are enrolled in your building, for your own financial gain, things like that. So
I mean, that's almost like if we have teachers that decide to do some tutoring in the summer.
right. So
They're able to tutor and charge for that because of possibly the experience they gained by being a math teacher at FCPS. Don't have any right to their.
Right. And so we do have policy 315, which is on tutoring. And when I was going through and looking at all of the 300 series, my initial reaction to this tutoring policy was like, this should be collapsed with a couple of other things under a new board policy that I would call conflict of interest.
And I think that's actually slated to be on, a draft of that is slated for the
Did I
9/20
write something already?
I don't know, but I think that was slated for 9/27, so I hope so.
Okay, so that was a proposal that apparently I'd already been thinking through. Sometimes I'm not sure whether it was just in my head or I did it out loud. But a conflict of interest policy. So I might actually submit to the board. The theory would be that we would create a new conflict of interest policy, that we would deactivate 315, that we would deactivate 317, and capture the spirit of both of those, which are essentially about conflict of interest. And how do you manage and mitigate that as an employee? So that would be maybe if you'd like to, we could come back to this conversation with that in mind.
Yeah, I'm like Mr. Bass. I just think it's overly, or at least the interpretation is overly restrictive. I mean, because I think about all kinds of different professions. You might, because of your profession, be invited to come and be an adjunct professor.
I have served in that role.
There you
I
go.
currently serve in that role. Right, so yeah, I
But
think.
if a teacher developed a curriculum to go become an adjunct professor at FCC or Hood, would we restrict? I mean, You know, I would
Right, who's
rather be
managing
more
that?
open, like Mr. Bass said, we're trying to recruit the best and the brightest. Heck, I encourage them to continue to hone their skills, maybe teaching.
So if you would like, what, 9/27 is the next policy meeting?
It is.
We could come to you with a new policy that we could call conflict of interest and proposals to collapse the language of 315 and 317 inside of it. And so we'd be looking at a new policy and the deactivation of those other two. I don't know if there are others that would naturally, that are out there that are of, because I think 315, similar to 317, is about 20 years old.
We've already recommended deactivation of 315. We did that
Okay,
on July 26th
okay,
with the intention to prepare a new employee conflict of interest
there we
policy.
go. All
So
right.
it's already, that's why I say it's on
And I
the,
probably wrote that, but
Yeah.
I just don't remember.
but this is, I mean, that's why I wanted to bring this 317 to the table today as information and discussion, because looking at it, I don't know what way to go with it. Now, I think we have some direction. We will likely come to the table presenting this as another deactivation, rolling it into a new conflict of interest policy.
And I will say this will help us in so many ways because Dr. Dyson has asked me to work on a companion to the Student Code of Conduct, which is an employee code of conduct. And as I've been reading the employee code of conduct from other school systems, the anchor to a good employee code of conduct is board policy and regulation, right? It's a sort of an employee code of conduct is a way of packaging all of that language that's out there in the policy and regulations in a school system that govern expected behaviors and forbidden behaviors. And so this sort of tightening up, so as I've been drafting this and as I've been reading others, I'm realizing more and more some of the policy gaps that we have that make creating an employee code of conduct difficult because it's sometimes unclear what is permissible and what is behavior that's not allowed. So this will actually really help us with that body of work as well. Our target for the employee code of conduct is July 1, 2024. So this gives us a great year to solidify some of those pieces. Okay, that's my action. Apparently I've already started it.
I hope so.
Apparently I have.
I think that'll be great. It'll be interesting on whether policy 314 political activity should also be included. I'm not certain. In clicking on that policy, I'll just briefly say, we've had that discussion multiple times here, and is the reason that what's online revised 2016 that we haven't finalized it?
It has not gone to the board. Okay. We approved 314 to move forward to the board, I believe, at the July 26th meeting as well. And it is in queue to go to the board, but a lot of what is in queue is waiting for policy 114 to be finalized so we can apply the new policy process to it. So, and a lot of what we've done with 300 is deactivation to condense into a single policy. So when these come back to the board, when they're finally ready to bring to the board, they're going to come as a package, and it's going to be we are presenting new 300 and 301, 302, 303, 304 are all deactivations because they're rolling into 300, and we're going to bring them in clumps.
Your point, Mr. Bass, I had to go back and remember, there were two other policies that I had thought in my mind could be rolled into a conflict of interest. One is policy 308, which I don't remember what my notes were on that, but policy 308 is personal and academic freedom. So that's sort of in that realm of what's permissible. And then the other is policy 324, which is about reporting allegations of fraud or illegal activity. So those, to me, all four of those can be collapsed. What did I write on that
So
sheet?
308 we approved for deactivation on April 26th, which would have been my first.
And did I write to fold it into a conflict of interest?
I don't have that in my notes here. And then 324 we had marked with revisions. It was not folded in.
So I think those four can all be combined, and I'll keep looking to see if there are other. I mean, my only hesitation about political activity is that's a pretty lengthy one that has a lot of nuance, whereas these are sort of shorter.
I agree with you.
Okay. Okay, so I'll come back to you with a new policy that covers all four of those existing. Okay. Great.
And that's it for the agenda for today. back September 27th.
And so in terms of what's going to the full board, policy 114 will go to the board for our next board meeting.
Correct, not this evening. It will be on the September 13th agenda.
So then, once hopefully that is approved.
Then on September 27th, it would be on the agenda as an a consent action item. And then assuming it is approved that day, the policy at that point will then be implementable, and we will start working on the creating the policy analysis forms for all of these existing policies. Some of those forms will be very easy, right? If it's deactivation, all the form is going to say is we're deactivating it to, move it in, roll it into policy, whatever, and no impact for all of the other questions. So it will be, some of those will be relatively easy to create. Things like policy 300 are going to have a very robust policy analysis form because there's going to be a lot happening.
I guess part of my question too is just in terms of time frame, when Mr. Rose just mentioned, maybe there's an upcoming board meeting when we're ready to proceed with the review of the chunk of the 300 series that we've worked through here, that we could block off a good chunk of time in a work session to be able to move.
And yeah, as part of the agenda setting process, I'm certainly open to, focusing or devoting a work session or having a special work session just to address,
adding an hour.
just to address policies and knock out as many of them as we can. The big ones, 300, 314, they're going to take a little time to walk through and talk through and, and have that discussion that we need to have about them.
We should just be careful in terms of agenda setting and meeting. At least two of us on the board have had some trouble making the 2 p.m. meet, and so we should just be thinking about how to get most or all of the board into that conversation.
All right.
There's nothing else, then
Nothing else.
0.09. Adjourn.
Great. Thank you.